we want to talk about the unsupervised learning approach. Like the name actually connotes unsupervised. It means that there is little or no supervision behind the curtain. But that does not mean you do not direct it. But the supervision in this case has to do with the label. So anytime that there is a label that you are teaching the machine to recognize, we call that a supervised learning problem. But anytime that there are no labels, you just throw the features into the algorithms and tell them you recognize, find similarities, find patterns, and then return these things to us. We want to understand what sort of patterns are happening in this data set. That's more like an unsupervised problem. And then there is now another approach where you have this unsupervised, you throw them, you get some label, you use them for the supervised learning. We call that semi-supervised. So it's kind of these three approaches that we have: the supervised, semi-supervised, and the unsupervised. So in the unsupervised, you don't have any level. But I want you to understand that these three approaches, they cross-talk with each other. So you can come from supervised to unsupervised. You can come from unsupervised to supervised. When we start going into generative AI, I'll begin to show you guys how we moved from unsupervised, we come to supervised, and then we get some sort of labels, and then we map them again to the net tokens. Like that, we'll be kind of playing around with this method. So the both of them all these approaches are not working in isolation. They are always cross-talking with each other. And when we talk about AI, data science, machine learning, we are always looking at the best way we can be able to understand the problem. So we are not really restricted like the traditional approaches like statistics, where you have to, follow a particular route. You cannot deviate from the assumptions, because you have to make assumptions. You have to, write out your hypothesis and say, this is what you want to set out to do. And then if you deviate, you violate these assumptions. No, most of the time in AI, you really need to beat the data. So it is like the data you have to punish in order for you to get your desired result. So it means if you are dealing with the data, you have to subject the data set to so many procedures in order for you to arrive at a very good conclusion. So, but statistics and all these other traditional approaches, on the other hand, they will kind of make prior assumptions before they go into the modeling. A good example is the frequency statistical approach. And the frequency statistical approach, when it sees the data, the first thing that comes to its mind is, okay, can we determine like the mean? Can we determine like the median? Can we do this? Can we do this? Can we use binomial distribution to this? But the Bayesian will say, no, why not we make out and combine the conditional occurrences and the prior in order for us to determine the posterior. So this whole approach is that that ensues some level of flexibility is what you are really looking out for when you're talking about machine learning, AI, data science approach. We want to always find the best way we could. And that's why you see, as you progress, you begin to see where you have to put in domain knowledge in order for you to improve, for example, the performance of your model. So the unsupervised learning is simply training the model on unlabeled data to find hidden patterns or structures. So most of the time, the data set, when you collect them, they are, like I always used to tell you, they are points, they are time points you collect them. So when you collect these points, there is that high level of the fact that they are going to be similar. And I tell you, like, if you're looking at data set in the medical domain, like healthcare data set, let's say you're looking at data set that has to do with with diseases, let's say hypertension, diabetes, and the rest, the likelihood that you're going to find them clustered around gender, age, or ethnicity is going to be high, because this set of variables have these structures that make them to be similar compared to the other variables. So the unsupervised is simply looking for these hidden structures or patterns that exist in the data set. So a good example visually is that you could imagine if you have this set of features, you throw them into the unsupervised algorithm. So what it's going to do is going to find a way to cluster these data sets that are similar together in order to, I'm mere looking at the data set here, you can't find any structure. But when the unsupervised trick it, find out what are the centroids, what are the distance apart of those variables, what is the neighborhood, and so on and so forth. It will be able to hold them, together, and you could be able to say, oh, you're now beginning to see these structures appearing. So there are several types of unsupervised learning approach. The first one that you need to understand is called the dimensionality reduction approach. Now, the dimensionality reduction approach, it's that approach that has to do with handling high dimensional data set. As a result, like I told you guys, most of the time in the real world, you're faced with sparsity, you are faced with cost of dimensionality, where you discover sometimes the rows are even lesser than the columns, or the columns are more than the rows. So it depends on, how the data sets are collected. And that could make you in such a situation to, if you are modeling this data set, you are likely going to have issues of sparsity. And because of the complexity of the data, you may not find reasonable signals other than noise that you will be picking. So the dimensionality reduction approaches help us to be able to condense this data set in sort of linear combinatory and form, and then we could project them into another dimension, and we'll be able to find those variability that exist in that particular cloud. Then, secondly, there is the clustering approach. So the clustering, like the name suggests, you cluster them or group them into a particular groups. Like you break them down into based on their similarity features. You say, okay, this is group one, this is group two, this is group three, and so on and so forth. Then we have the association learning. Now, the association learning is also an unsupervised learning that you do them also based on similarities you must have observed in the data set. You will now say, no, based on what I'm seeing, this is supposed to go here, this is supposed to go here, and this is supposed to go here. A good example is the grocery sort of shopping. Most of the time, you when you are shopping in the supermarket, you discover that you're getting recommendation based on some of the past things you have shopped, and then you're beginning to see that most of the things like let's say that has to do with food, they will tend to pop up in a different section. The ones that has to do with toiletries will be on a different section. Like that, there's always grouping. So such kind of grouping, even movies like you see on platforms like Netflix, it mostly uses these association rules to suggest the movies you should watch. Even Facebook use them. Most of the time, the friends that you have, that you see suggestion, friend request, and the rest, once you accept that person, the people that are under that person will pop up, because the algorithm will now know that, oh, this person has this kind of person similarities in common. Because of that, likely you'll see those things. So I tell you a good example for someone like me that I'm from Nigeria. Most of the friends that you will see in your radar will likely be friends from Nigeria. Then even in the Nigeria, the people you will find out, they are people you have gone to maybe the same elementary schools with, people you have gone to the same undergraduate school or postgraduate school. You always see them popping up in your radar, and you'll be wondering how. It is based on this association rules sort of approach that it makes recommendation for you to be able to know that these people are around your radar, and you could easily include them. Also, these association rules can be used in areas of security, like in data mining. Most of the time, security people use them a lot, because if you're looking at network, for example, if you create a set of networks of fraud, you could be able to trace it by looking at the associations around that particular network. You're likely going to see that this robbers or fraudsters, they don't operate in isolation. So maybe the kidnapper will collect the money from this person for ransom, they'll pay it to this account. So when you trace that account, you could be able to track how these things move until it gets to the hand of the end users. So most of the time, these fraudsters wonders how they are apprehended by security guys. But it's just to go get this information. Once they get the information where the ransom was paid, they will be able to now start looking at the association within each radar, and then they'll establish a connection. Another very good, another example of the unsupervised is the generative models, or we call them GANs. But this is still under neural networks. So I wouldn't really make emphasis on that, but I could only just tell you a bit about the generative networks. Now, we use this approach a lot when we are looking at there are times that we want to do some sort of we want to trick the model. We want to know how robust is our model. So what we need to do is to generate some sort of noise, or we generate some sort of fake stuffs, and then we now compare it to the real. We distort, for example, an image, and then we see if the model will be able to recreate it perfectly. And the reason is because there are a lot of models, if you don't test their robustness, if you deploy them to the field, you're likely going to have issues. So because of that, you will see that you have to carry out some sort of generating sort of fakes and reels and all that, and then you post it up, and then you see if you're still going to get the model will still pick the real ones from the fake ones. So that's where the generative or GANs comes into play. And then we have the anomaly detection. This one simply based on outliers. And in our previous classes, I've tell you a bit of outliers, that, outliers are always those odd, the black sheeps, those ones that always stand out, So most of the time when you have data points and you know that the normal range or the upper bound is supposed to be within this limit, but then there are these guys that are always breaking the rules. They are always set apart. You know that those ones are anomalies, and you could be able to pick them out from your data set. Anyway, when we go further, I'll be able to talk about some of these examples. So we say why this matters is because most of the time, the unsupervised learning help us to simplify the dimensionality in the data set. And also it helps us to generate these new possibilities. So you could be able to understand the data, but now I could be able to know this is the kind of group that exists in my data set. And I'll give you an example. In my PhD thesis, I worked on COVID-19 genetic data set. So the first thing we did was to do some sort of statistical stuff to filter out genes that were relevant and so on and so forth. Then when we got the relevant genes, the next thing we did was we said, okay, these genes are still much. For example, we have some that we had around 1,300 and something genes, genetic variants. So we say, these genetic variants are much. We need to see if we could find some sort of grouping in this genetic variant data set. So we feed that and perform some sort of unsupervised learning. So when we did unsupervised learning, we used different approaches. Like we started with the dimensionality reduction. We tried to see if we could use PCA, and then we now eventually cluster the PCAs. But then there are this group that stood out. There were about 29 of them in that group. And this group, irrespective of the methods we use, we keep having them separate themselves. So the next thing we did was, okay, we need to zoom into this group. We need to understand what is happening. So when we zoomed into this group, ordinarily, what we started finding was, okay, we noticed that all of them in this group are all having severe COVID-19 symptoms. And secondly, we also noticed that people in this group are not necessarily old people. Rather, there are young people that are also in this group. So next, we now zoomed in to understand what sort of genes are prevalent genetic variants are prevalent in this group compared to the other groups. So stuff like that. And then when we got those genetic variants, the next thing we did was, okay, can we find target drugs for these genetic variants that have already been published in archives? So we started, looking out for biological signalings like pathways, enrichment analysis, and the rest. And then we begin to now map them to target drugs and so on and so forth. So you see that the unsupervised learning, it's really helped you to understand what you're doing and also open you up for new possibilities. And like you said, when you are walking through an unknown territory, which is your data set, most of the time you don't understand this data set. So the unsupervised learning really open you up to get to understand the structure of the data set. And then you begin to understand, like, now this is how you could be able to approach the problem, and this is how you could be able to approach the problem. So the dimensionality reduction technique, which is the first one we just looked at, comes in several ways. Like the name suggests, again, dimensionality reduction. It means that you're trying to compress the dimension. You're trying to, reduce that complexity in your data set. So they said data often comes with too many features, making it complex or hard to visualize. And I think in the previous videos with one of the classes with John, I really talked a bit about this dimensionality reduction, where I told him that humans, once we are above the three-dimensional plane, it becomes very difficult for you to approximate once you leave the three dimension, because the three dimension is the X, Y, Z plane. Once you go out of them, it's really, really difficult for you. So every other thing we begin to do, we will be pretending that we are working in those dimensions. So what happens is that the more features you have, the more that dimension increases. So if you have 3 features, you are still in the XY plane. 4, it means you have moved out of the XY plane. Now you draw another line. If you moved again to 5 features, you draw another line. So the more features you have, the more lines you draw to estimate them. So by the time you have so many of these lines drawn, it's very difficult for you to be able to find patterns. So what the dimensionality reduction does is that it simplifies these dimensions by picking this data set and finding a way to do some linear combinations. So when you do these linear combinations with the help of the edging values and edging vectors, it projects them into another dimension and pretend in that dimension is projecting that you only have you only focus on those linear combinations that are highly variable. So it will settle for the most variable component, and then you could be able to visualize it and see what is happening. So the most common technique in dimensionality reduction is the principal component analysis. And what the principal component analysis, or PCA, does is that it transforms the dataset into new features or principal components. Then it will capture the ones that has the highest variability and help you to. And usually the first and second dimension usually capture the high variability. But sometimes I've seen where we have worked with 10 dimensions, 10 components, because the first 10 components capture the variability, because we noticed the first 2 components, the variability was very small. But most of the time, the first 2 components capture those variabilities. That's PC1, PC2. So you will now be able to visualize them. So see the principal components as taking these lots of data set, putting them into this dimensional space where you will now transform them. And I think I have a slide that shows how this principal component should look like, and I'll explain that there more when we get. Then, and there is this tSNE. So the principle of the tSNE UMAP's approach is based on non-linearity, and I'll talk a lot about them when we also go further. The problem we have with PCA is that PCA assume linearity. So when you're projecting this data set, you just look at the linear combinations and then you settle for the ones with the high variability. So it means that there are other local structure that it's in your data set that you're likely going to omit because you are operating and assuming linearity, even when these data sets are not linear. And one of the problem again is that as the complexity increases, there is the high chances that linearity does not capture variability that exists in the data set. So if you're working with the linear model, you are likely you will not see these local structures in your data set. And that's not a good thing for you because you'll be leaving out a large portion of your data set unexplained because you thought the linear approach captures it. However, PCA is a very good approach and it's a very popular approach today. Most people use PCA. So it's not a bad approach, but it's not always the best. You have to also try other techniques to see. So the tSNE also reduces the data set in the 2D or 3D dimension. However, it emphasizes on the local structure, which we say local pattern. So that local structure or local minimals that you're interested in your data set makes the tSNE to be quite an improved way of visualizing the data set outside PCA. Then there is also the UMAP. The UMAP is also an extension of the tSNE. And the UMAP also operates using the principle of manifold. So, and I don't want to really go into the mathematics of this thing, but most of the time, the manifold are all telling us about the minimums, the local structure. We are just interested in zooming into the data set to find out those local structures that we cannot capture using either tSNE or principal component analysis. Then there is also a very good approach that is very interesting as well called autoencoders. The autoencoders is also a good dimensionality reduction approach that has to find the encoding, decoding, and you use some sort of functions to be able to approximate the data set, like the sigmoid functions. But the problem about the neural networks is that it's sort of a black box. So because of the black box, sometimes people wouldn't want to use it. But as the complexity of your data set increase, example, when you have things like image data set, PCA, tSNE, UMAP may not be the best way to capture the variability in it. So you have to fall back to approaches like the autoencoder in order for you to be able to understand what is really happening. Because what it will do is that it will open up this data set, right? Encoding it, and then it will decode the data set. So it's like compressing this data set into pixels, and then it find out all this representation, and then at the end of the day, it maps them again to you, so you could be able to understand what's happening. And like I said, well, as we go further, we get to see some of the examples and we get to understand how they operate. So in the PCA, consider this as the high dimensional space where your data set, exists. You could always see that, like I said, as you increase the variability, you increase this dimension. You could see for this first one, let's assume this is the XYZ plane. When you have another variable, you have to now maybe take it here again. When you have another one, you take it here again, you take it. So the more variables you have, the more it becomes very complex for you. So what the PCA is going to do is that it will find this linear combination for you. So when it finds the linear combination in your data set, it will now be able to project them in another lower dimensional plane where you can now pretend they are XY kind of plane. So you could see it takes this complex data set here, it fits a linear combination called PC1 and then PC2. And then when you visualize it, you could easily see that this is PC1 and this is the PC2. So it maximizes the variance along the PC1 and minimize the residuals along the PC2. And last week, I also told us about the errors. That the errors, once they are big, we're always looking at the methods that will help to give us a very small errors. So the PCA actually fits into that assumptions because it will help us to maximize the variance. It will also help us to minimize the residual errors. So which is quite an interesting approach. It means most of the time we don't have to worry about overfitting. We don't have to worry about some of these things because now it's operating in a very low dimensional plane. However, like I said, the PCA emphasized more on the global structure. So if you looked at this piece, this is the same data set of digit, for example. This is the PCA here. Because it emphasized more on the global structure, you could see that it didn't find some of the colors that you are finding when you use the tSNE. Remember, the tSNE is interested in local structure. So you could see that the tSNE still went further to balkanize this group here that the PCA found into almost three structures. You can see, let's say this is the first one, which was supposed to be here, and this it's find another group here, it finds another group here. So the PCA assumed the whole of these ones they belong to one group, or one cluster. But the tSNE said no, we can still find three clusters in the whole of this one. And the same thing we could see here, we could see here, we could see here, we could see here, see here, and so on and so forth. So the tSNE and also the UMAP could go further to balkanize what the tSNE found. So like the UMAP is an improvement to the tSNE is an improvement to the PCA. So you could see that the tSNE could find this because it doesn't rely on linear combination or assumption of linearity that the PCA always make. So that's why it could be able to find these local structures or minimals when it's zoom into the data set. But the case of the autoencoder, like I said, a very good example of the autoencoders is just visuals that was done on I think a pixel data set, and you could actually see the way it operates is that the autoencoders it will encode and it will decode, and then it will use like a sigmoid function to kind of project the last visuals for you. So because it's more like a pixel, what is doing is that it will be capturing a smaller pixel in the data set. So when we go into deep learning properly, I will emphasize on how these things work using sort of like a window where you could slide and capture this, you slide, you capture this, you slide, you capture this. But you could actually see how it works by transforming those variables. It's, continue to capture them, it continues to capture them until it gets to the final point. So all of them are all dimensionality reduction approaches, but they all have different ways at which they operate. Now, remember with this dimensionality reduction, do not mistaken them for clustering, okay? The dimensionality reduction just wants to reduce the dataset, and then you could visualize. However, clustering talks about grouping the dataset. So they are not the same thing, but most likely you will see them in the same exercises. So most of the time you think they are all brothers and sisters because they are always going to be on the same work. You will likely just do dimensionality without doing clustering, but they are not the same. The dimensionality just helps to reduce the dimension, and then the clustering talks about further grouping. And I have seen where we use the dimensionality reduction before we perform the supervised clustering, the supervised learning, because we have lots of data sets. So instead of us to go directly feeding this data set to the algorithms, we first perform the dimensionality reduction. Maybe we reduce them to 10 dimensions, and then we likely visualize them. But the problem with that is that if you are interested in the features that are important in that particular machine learning, you will not find them because you have already have linear combinations. These are no longer the features. So what you have are principal components. So because they are principal components, you cannot recover the original features. So the original features will be lost once you perform the principal component. Now, after you have done this dimensionality reduction, most likely you're going to perform clustering to group them, to be able to find groupings in the data set. So we say the clustering is all about grouping similar data points together based on their features. And then the clustering find this grouping without being told what they should be. So what it does is most of the time you do not just assume prior knowledge, you just feed the data set to it and then you see what you could find. And then by the time you now find it, you're able to, oh, this is what you have understood from the data set. This is what it's looking like, then later on you could begin to tweak to find the optimal clusters that you have. However, I will talk about that shortly. So the common algorithm for clustering is the K-means clustering. So what the K-means clustering does is that it divides the data set into K groups by minimizing the distance between the points and their cluster centers or centroids. So the center of the clusters, most of the time we call them centroid. We call it centroid. And now what it does is that it will be for it to group them, it will look at how close that particular data point is from the center of the centroid. So when it finds the centroid, it will now, for it to say this data point belongs to this group, it has to look at the distance at which so like for example in this figure you could see there are three clusters. So most likely the data point here is far away from the data points here. So when it finds the centroid for the three of them, for it to say this belongs to this one or this belongs to this one, it needs to look at how far or close they are from the center point or the centroids. So the K-means clustering is a very interesting and popular approach because it's really helps us to be able to group the data set based on these similarity measures. Another very interesting approach of clustering is called the hierarchical clustering. The hierarchical clustering is a very, very interesting clustering. I think I've done a paper in the past on hierarchical clustering where I used it to examine crime data set in a particular area, and build up the dendrogram and all that. So what it does is that it builds a tree-like structures that we call dendrograms. And then it continues to merge them until it arrives at the point where it have one cluster. So here is how it goes. The first thing it does is that it will say every feature is a potential cluster. Every feature it will say is a potential cluster. Then it will start by saying if this feature is a cluster, this one is a cluster, this one is a cluster. So which of them are quite close to each other? So it's this and these are close. Then it will group them into one group. Now, it will now look at this one and this one are closer. It group them into one group. Then when it goes up again, it's this one and this one are closer. Because they are closer, they should belong to one group. And then it goes up again. When it goes up again, it will look at, okay, this one and this one are close, they become one cluster. This one and this one are close, they become one cluster. Then it goes up and group them as one cluster. Then it goes up again and looked at which one is close. Okay, the green is closer to the red, so they should be one cluster. And then when it goes up again at around 14, you could see when you also come from this direction here, you see that, okay, this one and this one are closer. The purple and the blue, the sky blue are closer together, so they should belong to one cluster. Then when you go up again, you now join them to become one cluster. But what the hierarchical clustering does is that you can cut the tree. You can cut it at a particular cutoff. So you could decide to cut it around here, around 3. So if you cut it around 3, you are going to have just 3 clusters. It means you are going to have this cluster here, which you have the red cluster here, you have the green one here, and you have the blue one here. So if you moved upward again and cut it, you will only have two clusters, meaning you will have this one and this one. But when you cut it here, you already have just one cluster. So you could get a cutoff to cut it here. You could also cut it here. You could cut it even at around 2. But as you continue to step up, that's how the clusters will continue to shrink. So what it does is that you can come either by merging it through the bottom, or you can come by splitting it from the top. So you could come bottom up, or you could come from top to bottom. That's a very good phrase that my president, no, it's not, I wouldn't say my president, because I have not yet accepted those guys to be my president. The president of Nigeria, the former president, Buhari, said from top to bottom. So this is what he meant when he said top to bottom. And then, so you could come from up here, or you could come from the down, upwards. So depending on any approach you come. Then another nice clustering approach again is the DBSCAN. And the DBSCAN, what it does is that it identifies the clusters of any shape based on the density of or noise in the data set. Now, what the DBSCAN does is that it's also more like what we talk about non-linearity, linearity, and all that. So it will further zoom into these clusters and then fit them. However, the problem we are having with the DBSCAN is that the more we increase the K, so the DBSCAN works with a lot with what we call the Euclidean space, and also we also have to talk about a lot about the density. We have to play around with many of those things. We have to test maybe 2, we have to test 3, we have to test 4. We can sort of test them. So if the K is big, we are going to find lots of clusters. But if the K is small, we will have no. So if the K is big, we'll find few clusters. If the K is small, we will find so many groups. So it's kind of you have to make a lot of trade-off. However, it is good for you to try all these approaches, and then you arrive at the ones that work best for you. So sometimes you see you start from K-mean clustering. After you've done K-mean clustering, you'll go further to do hierarchical clustering. You go further to do DBSCAN. But each of them, like the K-mean clustering, how you'll be able to determine the optimal clusters is through an approach we call the elbow method. And then another approach is the SWOT measures. The SWOT measures also help us to be able to find the optimal clusters. And there are also so many other approaches. I think that there is the Clang something measure as well. So many other measures that you could use to determine optimal clusters. But there is no uniform measure that you say this is it. No. I can look at the data set and say 3 clusters are fine. Somebody can look at it and say, no, maybe 5. Somebody can say, no, 6 or 7 clusters. So there is always that, sort of argument about the optimal clusters. So that makes the unsupervised learning to be sometimes subject to, sort of arguments on which should be or which should not be the best clusters. But these measures do help for us to be able to know how to determine the optimal clusters. So if you looked at the elbow, you could be able to say, okay, when we looked at some of these things in detail, you begin to see how we determine the optimal cluster. So don't worry, you will see how we could go about it. Then anomaly detection. Like we said, the anomaly detection, it focuses on spotting the odd ones out in the data point that don't fit the usual patterns. So, like I said, most of the time, for example, when you understood, a lot of people that do laboratory science, they used to face some of these issues. I remember when during my remedials in my pre-undergraduate, we carried out chemistry titration, where we go to the lab and we meet, I think, acid-based titration. And if I'm not mistaken, that day it was a week a weak base versus a strong acid. I think hydrochloric acid versus a very weak base, and I can't really remember the name of the weak base now. But so the instructor had a particular range that she expected the acid to neutralize the base, or the base, I don't know how to put it now, but she had a set of values that she was expecting to get for each of the groups, because then we have different groups. So group 1, group 2, group 3, and all that. So my own group, when we get to a certain range, we find out that it neutralizes. So, however, when she go over to see the value for each of the groups, to see their values. So when she came to our table, she continued to insist that we should have to get this value. We should have, and then when we keep arguing over it, going back and forth, we say, okay, she should come and perform it. And then she performed it and she got that same value. So it has to make her to re-examine the whole value that she already had in mind. So why am I saying this? Because that was an example of an anomaly, because others were getting this point and we were getting that point. So that calls for attention. Say, oh, this shouldn't be this range, but it should be the other way around. So the anomaly is always that odd one inside the other one. So for example, when you go to the hospital and they take your BP, they expected maybe a normal range, and then maybe that day the BP was out of that range. The doctor will quickly spot it, and then you begin to now ask you questions like, "Oh, did you sleep? Did you have some anxiety issues and all that?" So they could be able to understand the concern why they got this measurement that was odd from the other ones. So the algorithm will learn what type data, what the typical data looks like, and then it flags anything that deviates significantly. When you look at this example, all the fishes, even though they are not the same color, they were all facing a particular direction. All of them were going this way. But then there was this odd guy here that was going that way. So that makes you to easily know that this is an anomaly in the data set. It's not supposed to be this direction, but it's supposed to face this other direction. So a good example again is fraud detection. Most of the time, you will discover that sometimes you get message that your ATMs have been blocked because somebody was attempting to log in. Sometimes even you yourself, you could attempt to use your ATM and then maybe you forgot your PIN. But then you discover on trying for like 3 consecutive times, they will block your PIN and you have to go to the bank and then you complain. Then they could be able to figure out what's happening. So the reason is because they train the algorithm to recognize that the owner of this account is supposed to get it after second logged in. So if the person couldn't get it at the first 2 attempts and the first 3 attempts, sorry, on the 4th attempt, block it. So the algorithm will already have it on it so that anything beyond the third logged in, it should be put a restriction on that account. Now, if they don't put that restriction, anybody can continue to guess randomly until they guess the right PIN of that person, and then they will be able to open up their account and remove them and remove money from their account. So stuff like that, the anomaly, it's very, very useful in life because it's really helping us to detect or spot these odd things in the society. Then I talk about the association rules earlier on, where I said the goal of this is to find relationship between the variables in a large data set. So it's about discovering if this, then what? If this, then that, stuff like that. Like I said, if you go to the supermarket or you're watching Netflix movie, in the supermarket, you have like a basket analysis where you find that people who buy bread often buy butter. So you often see the milk, egg, sugar, bread that are likely going to be what customer one is known to be buying over time. And maybe customer two buys milk, egg, cereal, and also bread. Then customer three just have a sugar, egg and sugar. So what do my customers buy? That's the kind of question that will pop into the owner of the supermarket. You begin to say, what do my customer buy? Which products are bought together? So that I don't have bread and I don't have egg and I don't have butter for them. So if they buy bread and they don't, they don't get butter, maybe with time they will move to another location that has these things that they could easily pick. So the aim is to find association and correlation between the different items that the customers placed in their shopping basket. So in the case of the association rule, the algorithm we use is called the a priori sort of algorithm, which identify the frequent items and generate the rules. So what it does is that by the time it groups them into this sort of clusters, the next thing is to now find the what ifs. So if this person picks a bread, he's likely going to pick this one. And I tell you, like these rules, like I talked with someone some years back, and I told that person that when we looked at insecurity in sub-Saharan Africa, like Nigeria, that I feel the security guys, if they have lots of data set, why not make this data set available to experts that could really help you to find out some of these patterns over time on how these terrorists operate? Because I was telling the person, I said, you can be able to understand how they operate. For example, when you analyze their data set, you can be able to find terrains where they frequent. You can be able to find a particular time where they have heightened level of attacks. You can also find out the modes of attacks they carry out, even the kind of weapons they do, and all that. So by understanding this kind of patterns, you can be able to scale up your security architecture, and then you can know how to be able to, stop them. For example, at festive season, you are likely going to see high rates of, let's say, kidnapping happening. So how do you now mount the police and the army and all that in these sensitive locations that you have spotted from your data set that they could easily, curb the activities of these guys? So these association rules, they are not complex analysis, but they are analysis that could give you a pattern that you could use these rules to be able to build. Like I told you guys, the Facebook uses some of this to recommend friends for you. Netflix using it to suggest movies for you. And we can go about, counting how many of these industries that are using such kind of, approaches to be able to understand their problems. So we say product recommendation, inventory management, or customer behavior analysis can be done. Because one of the things people you shouldn't take for granted is your customers. You don't have to take them for granted. You need to understand the best way you could please your customers. You need to understand what is it that my customers really like. For example, if you upload a video on YouTube, you discover that some videos do not have lots of views. When you upload maybe a picture on Facebook or all those platforms, social media, you see, it doesn't have lots of comments, doesn't have a lot of views, because it's not really what the audience like. So you begin to think of how do I create what my audience really can, interact with it. And again, because most of the time it's not about you. It's about the people or the customers or the community you are trying to please. So you have to find in the best interest of your community or target audience, how best do you please them? How best do you say this? How best do you put this So you could be able to, create that impression that you are really out to satisfy them. So that behavior of your customers is very important, because, for example, people that are operating loan apps, they need to really understand the behaviors of their customers. It's not every customer that comes and tell you, "Oh, I'm going to pay you the loan. I assured you, if you give me this loan, and then you give that customer, and then the customer disappears into thin air. You don't see them. So, in order for you to give them loans, you have to understand the what ifs, so they don't collect your loan and then they vanish into thin air. And you see, these patterns will always be there because the data tells you everything you need to know. But the thing is, you have to make sure the data actually is sufficient enough to tell you about those things, because there could be the limitation of the data you collect. What if the data you collect does not, sufficiently capture some of these nitty-gritty that you needed in the data? So if it doesn't, then definitely the association rules will not hold water. So you have to make sure the data set is quite informative enough for you to be able to know what to do when they give you the pattern. So in the case of the generative models, we said the generative models learn to create new data that mimics the original data set. Think of it as an artist studying a style and then painting something new in that style. Like I said, most of the time it comes up, or it becomes a necessity when you are thinking about robustness of your model. Because the real world does not operate in a linear way. Today, for example, the weather will be so sunny. It's really a nice weather. Tomorrow, you wake up, everywhere is cloudy, thunderstorms, and all that. So you cannot build a model that is based on sunshine alone. You have to make sure the model you're building is able to capture all these changes that can happen. So the generative is a form of, when you train this model on a particular truth, you want to see what happens when it's tweaked this way, what happens when it's done this way. So the generative model might mix this original data set to create some of these things. A good example, for example, when you have an image data set, this image in your training set, you will show the model what the original image looks like. And then when you feed the model to the discriminator, it's going to distort, the model by introducing noise into the model. So when it introduces noise into the model, it now helps the model to see if this is the true image, then this should not be. A good example is deepfakes. I don't know if you've heard of deepfake, where you see popular presidents and celebrities and other notable figures talking about things, and they are not even the one talking, but somebody is using their voice, using almost their tune to pass message, and people could easily get convinced that it is that person, even though when it is not that person. And especially in this generative AI period, there is heightened level of this. And I'll give you an example. Not so long ago, I think like 2-3 months ago, there was an incident of a woman in France that had been chatting with someone she mistaken to be Brad Pitt. I don't know if you watched the movie called Troy. That actor in Troy, the husband of Angelina Jolie, I guess. No, I think her ex-husband. I think they're divorced now. So she'd been chatting with the person to an extent. She would do video calls with him. She would even get to, he sends her pictures and everything. So one time he came up and told her, "Look, I'm very sick." He said he's sick and he's in the hospital. He needed money for treatment and all that. And then she got convinced. And she asked him some question that, oh, are you not a famous person? Are you not supposed to have money? And he said, oh, I lost this money because of divorce and all that. And then she sent him the money, only for Interpol to track this person and discover that it was a guy that was doing that in Nigeria, you know. And these guys were able to do this thing such a way that she completely thought she was chatting and building a relationship with Brad Pitt while he was not the one. So that's the kind of things you'll be seeing in the real world. There are distortions. They will distort this thing. So what you will do is to train your model to recognize these things. Because if you have a model, for example, that is sensitive, the model will pick up things and it will definitely say, this is not Brad Pitt. This is a scammer. Because probably it will look at the voice. Probably it will look at the environment. Probably it will look at the sound. So there are things you could be. So in order for you to make sure your model could detect such things, you will introduce this noise to be able to distort the process so that when you deploy the model out there, it will be able to effectively model what you want it to capture. And of course, the bad guys are always changing their scheme. They are always improving on their abilities. So you have to make sure you also caught up with them. Don't have to be behind. So that's why you need to be finding the best possible way to capture this complexity so that your model will not just go out there and be misbehaving, and then it will be only spotting lots of negatives or false positives, and then the real events are left uncaptured. So these are some of the things that you have to be very, very careful when you are building your model. So the generative adversarial networks is two networks that generates the data and also critiques the data. So it will be able to generate the fake data and then it will tell the model, this is true, this is untrue. So what helps a simple architecture of the GANs looks like this, where you feed it with the data set, it generates the data set, and then it maximizes the variational autoencoder, and then it learns the dataset distribution in the new samples that it generates. So it has some sort of encoder and also decoder, and then it will now be able to make the comparison in the final phase to recognize the likelihood of this particular sample to be real or to be fake.